For more than 40 years and 1,600 columns, one journalist's quest for truth and honesty has taken him down many dark and seedy paths, unrelenting and unafraid. Guided by the light of truth, he has traveled many difficult journeys as a watchdog for all, ever vigilant. Then, one day, the presses fell silent. The newspaper for which he toiled closed forever. Undeterred, the scribe goes on.
Welcome to another edition of the Scribbler Publishing Group podcast, sponsored by the Mahoning Valley Historical Society. I'm Cynthia Rickard, editor of the book No Holds Barred, which is dedicated to the now defunct Youngstown Vindicator. I spent 41 years at the Vindicator and was the night and online editor when the paper closed its doors on August 31st, 2019, bringing to an end 150 years of trailblazing journalism. For those of us who dedicated our lives to the newspaper, the closing has left a large hole in our hearts and has prompted the question, why? Today's podcast attempts to answer that question and to shed some light on the future of newspapers in America. Our guest today is Marty Baron, a veteran journalist and recently retired executive editor of the Washington Post. Mr. Baron appeared on CNN's Reliable Sources show and talked about his commitment to charting the future of the press in this country. Joining me in this discussion today is Bertram de Souza, who spent 40 years at the Youngstown Vindicator and was the editorial page editor and Sunday columnist when the paper closed. No Holds Barred contains about 300 of the 1,600 plus columns Bertram wrote during his time at the Vindicator. This podcast was produced by Robert McFerrin, the talented former art director at the Vindicator, and Andrew Kunkel.
Without archives, many stories of real people would be lost. And along with those stories, vital clues that allow us to reflect and interpret our lives today. We have seen prosperity and hardship, cultural shifts and time-honored rituals, benevolent citizens and dubious characters. For the past 145 years, Mahoning Valley Historical Society has built an invaluable archive of our people and their stories. Our collections have been a rich resource for all who search for clues and connections to our community's history. Visit us online at mahoninghistory.org to see why collecting Mahoning Valley history is our pledge to you.
Marty, thank you for joining us in a discussion of the future of the legitimate press. It's an issue that's near and dear to our hearts. Rickard had spent 41 years at the Youngstown Vindicator, and I had spent 40 years when the 150-year-old daily newspaper closed its doors on August 31st, 2019. When I saw you on CNN discussing your retirement as executive editor of the Washington Post, I was struck by your commitment to use your background, knowledge, and experience to find solutions to the ailing mainstream news media. So to begin this conversation, and we really appreciate you joining us, I'd like you to give us a thumbnail sketch of your life as a journalist and your tenure at the Washington Post, and then Cindy will start the discussion.
Okay, it's hard to give a thumbnail of my life and my time at the Post, given that it lasted all of 45 years. Okay. So, but look, I started in 1976 as a reporter for the Miami Herald in one of their small bureaus. It was a town of 12,000 people. The county had 50,000 people. It was a little bit up the coast from Miami, a few hours. And I was there for a few years, and I went to the LA Times in 1979 and was a business reporter, then became an editor. Then edited one of their large regional editions, the largest that they had in Orange County, just south of LA. I worked for the New York Times ultimately as their editor in charge of night news operations. So I was the most senior person at night there, overnight essentially. And then I became the editor of the Miami Herald in 2000, the beginning of 2000. Was there for a year and a half with some big stories, Elian Gonzalez case, the 2000 presidential election, and then moved to Boston in the summer of 2001. The attacks of 9/11 occurred 6 weeks after I arrived. 2 of those planes flew out of Logan Airport in Boston. And then also immediately upon my arrival, we launched into an investigation of the Catholic Church. And that resulted in publication starting in early January of 2002. And then I was there for 11 and a half years at the Boston Globe. And in the beginning of 2013, became the editor of the Washington Post. And of course, it's been an eventful time there. Everything from the NSA, the first big story really was the NSA leaks by Edward Snowden. And then, of course, we had the Trump administration. So it's been an eventful career, 45 years, 20 years as a top editor. And so I retired on February 28th, and here I am on your podcast.
Thank you for being with us. How are you adjusting to retirement?
Fine. I've actually been quite busy. Been talking to a lot of people about different opportunities, and as was announced a few weeks ago, I am embarked on a book now that will look primarily at the time at the Post, but also look back at some other major stories, including the ones that I just mentioned, and so I'm starting to work on that, and that will require the bulk of my attention.
Great. Go ahead, Sue.
First of all, you failed to mention the movie that came out of your the big story at the Boston Globe. Did you have a cameo in that movie?
I did not have a cameo. Of course, I didn't mention it because I didn't make it, but
okay.
So it was made. I was one of the people portrayed in it, but I did not have a cameo. I did not appear, and in fact, I only watched one day of filming, as a matter of fact, and up in Toronto, and so no, I didn't appear at all.
Probably the story.
I was offered an opportunity to do that when they had a scene at Fenway. I was offered an opportunity to be somewhere in the crowd, but I took a pass.
Well, that wasn't my first question, but I think that's probably the story that most Americans will know you by, so I thought we probably should mention it. Marty, nearly 2,000 papers have closed in this country since 2004, including about 300 last year alone. And many, like the Vindicator, were more than 100 years old. In addition, newsroom jobs at newspapers have been slashed in half in the last 13 years. Social media's rise and the assumption of traditional newspaper advertisers' revenue has been blamed, as well as changing readership habits. What do you consider the primary cause of all of these losses, and how do you explain to everyday Americans why they should care?
Well, let's start with the latter part. I mean, I think they should care because I think that people need to know what's happening in their communities. They need to know what's happening in the country. They need to know what's happening around the world. Perhaps the primary way that people learn about what's happening in their own communities is through news organizations. And the primary news organization which covers the communities in detail are newspapers, or ones at least with a newspaper heritage. And so when you lose them, you lose a huge reservoir of community information. You lose the capacity of people to understand what's happening in their cities and their towns, and also to be engaged citizens. So I think these news organizations are really core to democracy, good democracy at the most grassroots level. And I think that makes them critically important. And without them, democracy simply does not function well. Unless people know what's happening in their government, unless they know what's happening with the other institutions in their society, they cannot be really engaged citizens. And one needs news organizations, reputable news organizations, to be providing a sort of independent watch on all of these organizations, whether it's the police, the city council, the county commission, the courts, you name it, and an organization that is approaching it with independence and integrity. As to why news organizations are going out of business, well, it's complex, but I mean, ultimately, it's the result of largely the internet. You know, and not just the internet, but the penetration of high-speed broadband starting in the early 2000s, which made possible a lot of the things that we're well familiar with today, and that is mobile phones, which didn't exist before the mid-2000s, social media, which didn't exist before the mid-2000s, video online, all of that. Advertisers gravitated toward social media companies, toward Facebook, toward Google, toward search engines like Google, and because it was more efficient for them. And that deprived local news organizations of a huge amount of revenue, an enormous amount of revenue. And then they all, starting with classified advertising, but then moving toward display advertising. And also it gave the impression to the public that they should just get information for free. And so, you know, that in a nutshell really is what's happened to the media industry. And local news organizations, which at one time were considered to be somewhat protected from all that, have actually ended up being hit the hardest.
Yeah, Marty, and in fact, I'm reminded of Warren Buffett when he decided and made a comment publicly that every community needs a newspaper to cover what's going on locally. And he made this commitment financially to buy a lot of small papers and also some big ones, and tried to sort of meld the revenue streams. And I guess has conceded that it's a huge challenge, and things didn't work out as he thought they would. So in that regard, how do newspapers adjust to the new reality of media?
Right. I think that Warren Buffett found that it was more difficult than even he imagined.
Right.
It was, you know, there are many people who think there isn't really a good, strong model for local journalism, and certainly news organizations are struggling to find one. Some there do seem to be some signs of promise in certain areas, but they're limited. You know, if I had an easy answer to this, I'd be selling it, frankly, because everybody's looking for it.
Right.
So I don't pretend that I have that. I do think that it's really important that that the public pay for news, and because you know, we always charge for a newspaper. It's not like we gave it away. Yes, there were some free weeklies and things like that, but for the most part, people were charged. Now, they weren't charged the full value because we made so much money on advertising, and so we charged people very little. So, you know, we acculturated the public into the idea that they didn't have to pay much or anything
Right.
For news. But now we have to. It's clear that if in order to pay reporters, in order to pay everybody else who's involved in producing a newspaper or news per se, whether it's on paper or not, that requires revenue, requires income. People need to be paid from somewhere, right? So that is. So I think it's important that people pay. Now, in order for people to pay, there has to be a fair trade, and the trade is that we have to provide them something worth paying for. We have to provide them something that has real value to them, and so it's incumbent upon local news organizations to figure out what it is they can provide that no one else does, and that is also highly valued by the people and the citizens of their community, and that is the challenge. I also think it's really important that they figure out a way to, I mean, I think the reality is that physical papers are disappearing over time. I don't know when they'll completely disappear, but I predict that eventually they will. The reality is that people live a digital life today. You know, we're doing this interview over Skype.
Right.
So that tells you just how far we can sit here and see each other and hear each other talk. You know, that wasn't possible not that long ago. And it just shows you how rapidly technology has advanced. And so people are living on their cell phones, they're living on social media. That is where they get information. It's important that local news organizations figure out how to operate in that world and not imagine that somehow print physical newspapers are going to make some sort of comeback. I think that's a false hope, and they have to figure out how to work in the digital world. Now, if they do figure that out, I mean, that is there are far fewer costs associated with being digital than there are with being a physical newspaper. No one today would say they want to start a physical newspaper. I mean, it's just not an efficient. It's not an efficient model.
What kind of balance did the Washington Post strike between the physical newspaper and online editions? And how did you come about with that formula?
Well, it wasn't a formula per se, but it was, look, when we were acquired in 2013, October 1, 2013 by Jeff Bezos, we were already moving toward digital by then, but it would accelerated after his acquisition. It became clear, as he pointed out, which we already knew, was that we live in a digital world, and that our growth, if we're going to have growth, it's going to have to come from digital, not from print. That people just didn't live that way anymore. And so our additional investment all went into digital. It didn't go into the physical paper. So the balance really was that when they were looking at new investment, just about, not exactly 100%, so let's say 99% of the investment went into digital efforts as opposed to print efforts, because we were investing in growth. There was no point in investing in something that was going to decline over time and that wasn't going to offer us any opportunity for growth.
Marty, one of the, there's a number of financial models that are being floated to try and help the industry, and one of them is a support tax on Google and Facebook. I'm wondering what you think about that, and how do we deal with social media, particularly those two, publishing all of these copyrighted stories with no remuneration to the organizations that produced them or the reporters that wrote them?
Right. I don't have an answer on the tax. I don't know enough about that proposal, to tell you the truth. I mean, I do think that we as news organizations have to find our own solutions. I don't think that, you know, I think it's quite possible that there will be some form of remuneration from the tech companies to news organizations. I wouldn't hold that out as a panacea. I think that, you know, we have to figure out, well, what form of compensation should there be? The reality is that not only they're kind of frenemies, you know, to the news industry. On the one hand, they're enemies in the way that you describe, and that they've siphoned off a lot of our advertising. On the other hand, far fewer people would read us if they weren't available. And so we derive value from that as well. So calculating how much should actually, what the compensation should be, is far more difficult than I think that people imagine, And so they always have the option of saying, okay, fine, we won't carry you, which they did in fact threaten to do in Australia when they were effort to impose a tax. They're not required to carry us. They could just say, fine, you won't show up in Google search results. That seems to be what you want. And we would probably scream at that. Facebook could say, we're not going to put you in the news stream. That seems to be what you want. Is it what we want, really? I mean, we have to think through. We have to think this through more deeply than probably we have today.
What about the Local Journalism Sustainability Act that was proposed in Congress in 2020, I believe? Do you know what the status is, or what the chances are of it getting approved?
I don't know. I actually have not followed that. I'm sorry.
Okay.
And this is in discussing and preparing for this podcast, I came across an Associated Press story from Rome with the headline, "Pope challenges Vatican's journalists, quote, who reads your news?" And the story said that Pope Francis challenged the Vatican's own media employees to essentially justify their continued work, asking them how many people actually consume their news, and in a critique of the office that costs, according to the AP story, combined costs of more than all the Catholic embassies, the Vatican embassies around the world combined. But he said, here's what he said: the Pope warned the Vatican's journalists against falling prey to lethal functionality, where they go through the motions but don't actually achieve anything. To what extent are newsrooms being challenged, and how should they respond to such a challenge about actually being relevant and not just going through the motions that, I guess occurs in newsrooms.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't think we're being challenged. Newsrooms are being challenged enough in that regard. I mean, I do think that we have our sort of the ways that we tend to do things, the things that we sort of have done this for so long. It's really important that we rethink that. I mean, look, when we were publishing on a physical newspaper, we made the assumption that everybody read everything we published,
right?
Because we really have the data to show that they didn't. But if anybody, I mean, I used to do this when I was a reporter. I would sit in a coffee shop and watch people read the paper, and I'd wait for them to land on my story and read it, and then they'd flip the page, and it's very humbling. I mean, now we actually have data. We can see exactly what people are reading and what they're not reading. And, we do have to, obviously we want to be guided by our own instincts and what's journalistically appropriate and what's not. On the other hand, we can't ignore, what is the information that people find most relevant in their lives? And I think that's something that we have to ask ourselves: is where should we allocate our investment? We live in the world. We live in the real world. We live in the world of economics, and economics is the allocation of scarce resources. I mean, and certainly we have scarce resources within news organizations. So we have to make some really tough decisions about, where is that money going to be invested, and what kind of coverage should we do? What should we do more of? What should we do less of? And we can't just fall back on this notion that, well, that's the way we've always done it. That's the way we like to do it. That makes us happy as a newsroom to do that, whatever it might be. We really need to take a hard look at, what is the information that our citizens really want from us, and then provide that to them and do it really well.
I'm sure there are journalism schools around the country that are dying to have you as a guest speaker to impart your wisdom. But journalism has changed from the time we started in the business a long, long time ago to now. So what would be your advice to journalism schools and to, individuals who want to be journalists in this day and age? What should the focus be, and what kind of preparation should occur in classrooms?
Sure. Well, I'm not an expert on the subject, but my general view is that they have to teach the basics, how to report, how to write, the core ethics principles of the profession, and why we have them. I think those are incredibly important. But then they also have to teach how storytelling is changing, how the way that we communicate is changing. The reality is that, keep in mind that over time, the ways that stories are told has changed significantly. If you look at a newspaper story today, it's quite different from the way that newspaper stories were written a long time ago. And if you look at when radio came into development, radio made its presence on the scene. The way that radio stories are written is very different from the way that newspaper stories are written. And when television arrived, the way that television stories are written is different from the way that radio is done and the way that newspapers are done. All of them require their own form of communication. Well, now we live in the world of the internet, and the internet is calling for a different form of communication too. And it allows some very different forms of storytelling that, in fact, can be more powerful than what we've had before, because they can take advantage of these tools that are available to us now on the internet that never were before the mid-2000s, as I was talking about before. So audio, video, annotation, animation, all of these different things, that interactive graphics, you name it, all of which can be integrated in a way that makes for some very, very powerful storytelling. And so I think schools should recognize that the nature of communication in news is changing, and that the students should be prepared to do that. So our values should stay the same. The core capabilities in terms of a journalist, what they should be able to do as a reporter and as a writer, are basically the same. But the form of storytelling is changing, and they need to teach that as well. So they have to operate on two tracks.
Marty, do you still encourage young people to go into the profession? In my last years at the Vindicator, I was sitting next to a photographer who repeatedly told our interns, get out. Don't find another thing to do, don't even think about it. And I wonder, it used to just drive me crazy, but we've got all of these citizen blogs that are cropping up, these citizen news reporters. First of all, I'm not sure where they're going to get the legal protection if they get sued for libel, but I would like to hear what you think about where the profession is going. Is it still a profession that is worth getting into, in school especially, because it's costly to go to college and get that kind of training?
Sure. I mean, I think it is worth going into. I think we, as a democracy, we will always have a need for news and for information. I think there will be a profession at providing that kind of information. I think it's a real mistake for people in newsrooms to tell people to get out of the profession. I can tell you that we at the Post hired a lot of people who said they were coming out of newsrooms where people would tell them stuff like that, and it was really depressing, and they were happy to hear that people were optimistic about the future, and they were happy to be a part of it. And I think we should not despair. I mean, I think that's a real mistake. You never find solutions if you think you're not going to succeed. The only people who find answers are the people who think that they can succeed. If you think you can't succeed, you're never going to. And so, there are a lot of places. I mean, we have to be really careful about these predictions about our business. I mean, it wasn't that long ago, and I think people need to be reminded of this, where people were talking about the Washington Post going out of business. They were talking about the New York Times going out of business. The New York Times stock dropped from like $50 a share down to $3.50. It had to go to a Mexican billionaire to get financial assistance. People were predicting their bankruptcy just around the corner. I mean, it turned out not to be true. They're thriving now. The Post is doing well. Let's not be let's not despair so much. I mean, I think that's a real mistake. I think we should be looking at some of those news organizations out there that are beginning to find a way to succeed, whether they're commercially oriented, profit oriented, or nonprofit, or whatever they might be, and take lessons from them. I do think that the business is going to change, and I think as far as young people is concerned, I think that they can't assess the future strictly by looking at the old traditional news organizations. They should look at some of the new ones, and they're not just a bunch of independent bloggers who are doing, who are reckless. There's some quite high quality nonprofit news organizations out there that are doing really good work. And I think there will be more of that. And there are some efforts now, of course, to encourage that. And I'm not being Pollyannish about it, but by any means, because I think it's a huge challenge. But I don't think we should be despairing, and I don't think we should discourage people. And in fact, I encourage people, if they have a passion for it, I think they should go in. And I think the profession really needs people who can think differently about how we communicate. I think we need that fresh blood in our profession, very much so. We need it at every level. It's not just among reporters and editors, but we need it among publishers and owners and what have you. It's one of the things that we benefited from by having Jeff Bezos as the owner. Everybody focuses on the money, but that's just it was thinking differently about our strategy and about our approach, and I think it's really important not to just think that it's a matter of money, and certainly not to think that the way we've done things is necessarily the way that they always have to be done.
Yeah. But a more modern mindset then needs to be brought into the picture. I'm really happy to hear you say that.
People are trapped in history, and history is trapped in them. In 1875, pioneers and leaders of the Mahoning Valley set out to collect and preserve the historical origins of the community. In 1964, Mahoning Valley Historical Society opened to the public through the legacy of Olive Arms, now known as Arms Family Museum. In 2014, a landmark downtown Youngstown building became Tyler History Center through the generous spirit of Gene D. Tyler. Our locations serve this community in different ways, yet remain true to the vision and passion for saving our stories. Visit us online at mahoninghistory.org to see why preserving Mahoning Valley history is our pledge to you.
Marty, one thing that I found is different today is the political divide in this country has really infiltrated the mainstream media. I have in front of me a counterpoint about the media. This thing written by this conservative, and she says, Americans' trust in national news media is low and getting worse. Mainstream journalism has lost the respect of much of the public, though soul-searching and changes by the industry could reverse this trend. And she says a study by the Associated Press University of Chicago found bedrock journalism values are respected less by much of the general public than other competing moral values. Now, in my experience at the Vindicator, we used to be accused of being a Republican newspaper because Democrats who did not get our endorsement always accused us of being Republican, and then Republicans used to be accused of being a Democratic newspaper. Mm-hmm. However, when I was doing politics and became an editorial writer and the editorial page editor, we made it a point to balance. We had George Will and we had liberals and columnists and all of that. And while people would complain, there wasn't this kind of demonization of the newspaper that you find today. And so how do you address that? How do you overcome that?
Look, it's very difficult. I wish I had all the answers here for all the questions you're asking. We live in a very polarized society, and I would say it's even worse than polarized. I would say that there are sectarian divisions in our society right now, and we've already seen evidence of sectarian violence, in my view. And so, I think that this is a challenge for society as a whole, not just for the press. I don't think we can actually solve it. The reality is that, yes, trust has been low in the press. It's low and declining in a lot of other institutions as well. I think that's one of the things we have to keep in mind is that, trust in Congress is low. Trust in the presidency has declined, certainly in the last 4 years. Trust in big business has declined. Trust in religious institutions has declined. All of them have declined. Trust in institutions generally have declined. That should be a huge concern of ours. And all of us as people who are stewards of institutions really need to think through what can we do to restore trust. However, in a very polarized and divided society, I think it can be very difficult because people are asking you to pick sides. I think we've become almost tribal as a society, and people are saying, whose side are you on? And if you are strictly independent and you do not align with either side, and you're not 100% in agreement, then people will see you as the opposition. They'll see you as the enemy. How we get past that, it's really hard to say. I think that's a huge concern in America today. And frankly, it's not just a concern in the United States. I mean, people who talk about this, as you were describing, they forget that in a lot of the rest of the world, it's exactly the same thing. So there are huge divisions. The kind of polarization that we see here in the United States is what we're seeing around the world. It's something that the internet has also made possible, is that people can sort of collect in their own little tribes and only get information from sources that reinforce their pre-existing points of view. And so I don't have an answer to that. I mean, I think that ultimately we just have to fall back on our principles, which I don't think there's anything wrong with our principles. Our principles are at the Post, the first principle sitting on the wall, right on the wall, which you walk into the newsroom, is to tell the truth as nearly as the truth may be ascertained. What's wrong with that principle? Nothing. I mean, it recognizes that there is such a thing as truth, and that it's independent of who holds power or who has the biggest megaphone or whose interests are going to be benefited or, what have you. And it holds that our job is to try to pursue it. It recognizes that that can be a struggle, that truth can be elusive, but that we really have to work to that. I don't know what's wrong with that principle. And so those are my principles.
As you mentioned that, I'm thinking about the last 4 years of the Trump administration, and I have my own feelings about how the national press in general covered him and allowed the term fake news to come into popular use and to kind of allow lies and untruths to take hold. You were at the epicenter of all of that. How did you view how the national press handled that?
I don't know what we could have done, frankly. I mean, you have the President of the United States, who does have the biggest megaphone in the world, who is arguably the most powerful person in the world, using the term fake news day in and day out, and uttering that through the media outlets that are clearly aligned with him. What exactly were we supposed to do about that? I don't quite know. We were doing our jobs. That's basically what we were trying to do, and that is to gather the facts, put them in proper context, give the public the information that it needs and deserves to know as engaged citizens. And I don't know what we could have done. There's nothing we could have done that would have inhibited him from simply continuing to repeat that phrase. It's just, look, the media doesn't control the world. There's this assumption that everything is the result of what the media does or doesn't do. We're just one institution in society. We're not even the most powerful institution necessarily. So far from it. And so I don't know that we could have had any effect whatsoever.
Did you have any meetings with members of the Trump administration during their very public attack, especially on the Washington Post, day in and day out, and encouraging members of Congress who, towed the line for the Republican Party, also doing so? Was there any attempt made to try and explain to those folks in the White House what your business was, the way you're talking about it today?
There were many attempts by many people to do that. They were all ineffective. He didn't care what we thought. It was politically advantageous to him to have an enemy. He always did best when he had an enemy to cite. He always wanted to have an enemy. Otherwise, he would just simply judge him on his own merits, and as opposed to judging him against this imagined enemy. So whenever he ran out of some other enemy, he always turned back to the press, because we were always available to him, and because it was good red meat for the people who voted for him. And we're his closest followers, which I understand. I mean, that's politics, and he understood his. He was incredibly street savvy. He understood his base very well. He knew what they wanted from him.
Right.
And one thing that he did is he always provided the red meat that they were looking for. And so, he wasn't looking for. It wasn't a matter of like not being schooled in the matter or not understanding it. It's a matter of whether he could use it for political advantage or not. That's all. It wasn't like he was receptive to persuasion. I mean, it's just. Hey, look, he told Leslie Stahl early on. She asked him why he continued to engage in these attacks.
Right.
And he told her, I do it so that when you write something negative about me, people won't believe you.
I saw that early on. Yeah.
He was quite honest about that. He was quite transparent. He's often incredibly transparent about these things, and that's exactly right. That's what he did, is so that he wanted to discredit us solely for the purpose that if we wrote something that he didn't want us to write, people wouldn't believe us. He wanted to portray us as the opposition party rather than as independent arbiter of fact.
And what does it say? And perhaps this is an area where you don't want to pursue, but what does it say about his supporters who ignore his history? I mean, when he was a developer, he had friends in mainstream media. In fact, there are stories about how he used to, take on a different identity and call up favorite reporters and plant stories that were beneficial to him. And if you go through his history, time and time again, a lot of the things he said as president or as candidate for president were clearly at odds with the way he behaved as a private citizen and developer.
You mean a politician was
right.
inconsistent and a chameleon-like character? I'm shocked to hear about this. I mean, look, he was a Democrat also. I mean, I mean, he invited the Clintons to his wedding. I mean, one of the weddings. So, I mean, yeah, I mean, yes, he changed stripes. There's no question about it, because he was running for office, and it's like, what's going to get him elected? It's also not shocking that politicians will say things that they think will get them elected, and that those might be different from what they said before. Yeah, there were a lot of inconsistencies there, no question about it.
But poll after poll showed that during the elections, his supporters were much more greatly committed to him than those supporters, say, of Biden. The intensity rate of his support was much greater. And that disturbs me a great deal about 74 million Americans.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's definitely, I mean, I don't know about the intensity for all 74 million, but there is certainly an intensity of support among many of his supporters. Look, they believe in him. They like what they see. He talks the way they talk. They feel that he speaks their so-called truth. They like the fact that he attacks the press. They like the fact that he they like some of his policies, whether it's taxes on taxes or the Supreme Court or abortion or whatever it might be, and they find his manner, his manner that repulses some people. They love it. In fact, they like the fact that other people are repulsed by it. That makes them happy. The more outraged people are, the happier his supporters are. So they wanted him to go to Washington to get people upset. That's the whole idea. So to the extent that people are sort of all outraged by him, they're like, exactly, that's why we sent him there. So they're thrilled. So yeah, I mean, there's a personality cult that's developed around him, and it's something that we have not seen in American politics. To this degree in the past.
Do you think they miscalculated, though, that devotion to what he stood for when the insurrection finally happened? We had some people who went from our local area and were interviewed when they came back and said, we supported him, but we went down there, and as soon as that started, the one guy said, I told my wife, we got to get out of here. So I think a lot of people weren't expecting what happened to happen.
Well, right. I mean, obviously, the vast majority of the people there didn't participate in the attack on the Capitol, but there were still many hundreds of people who did participate, about 800 or so, who did participate on the attack on the Capitol. And so you can't label everybody with that, but. And look, I mean, to the people who said, I'm not going to be part of this and walked away, that's to their credit. But there's no denying what happened on January 6th. It was an attack on the U.S. government. It was an effort to subvert the will of the voters. And it was a shock. It's a shock to the system, something that none of us has ever seen in our lifetimes. And
continues in Arizona right now with the fraud that they're going through and some of these other voter suppression bills.
I'm not sure I'd call it an audit, but audit is actually the way that the term is conventionally described. So.
Yeah.
Well, we've come to this time when we should be wrapping up. The one thing that I have needed to ask you, because of your position at the Washington Post, a lot of newsrooms around the country are talking about whether or not newspapers should continue the policy of making endorsements, especially in political races. Now, I was involved in the screening of candidates, and I'm a firm believer that the editorial page and the commentary page, the opinion page, were reflected the voice of the newspaper and the views of the ownership. Where do you come down on that? Is that something that would sort of serve to help as far as the future goes, getting rid of endorsements and editorials and stuff like that?
I don't honestly think that if you got rid of endorsements, that it would have any material impact on people's view of the press. People want you to be 100% in their corner, 100%. So look what happened with Fox News. Simply by declaring that Joe Biden won Arizona, they
Right.
incurred the wrath of the president, and people and his followers started to abandon Fox News and go over to Newsmax and One America News Network, at least for a short while. And that's all it took for them to turn on Fox News. What makes us think that simply eliminating endorsements is somehow going to change the equation in any significant way? I don't have a well-developed view on endorsements. I tend to think that at the national level, look, people are going to make up their own minds. They're not really going to take a lot of direction from newspaper endorsements. I do think in local communities, I do think that part of the role of a news organization is to provide some sort of voice and leadership in that community, whether it's on endorsements or other issues that are more contentious. I mean, if you're going to stop endorsements, why not stop all editorials? Because people differ on all sorts of positions, some far more contentious than who's running for city council, for example. So I think that I tend to like endorsements. I think that they're good. I think that I think what's important is that the process of endorsing be a thorough and thoughtful one, and that the editorial boards do their jobs and do it well,
Right.
and give a lot of thought to it. And but I don't. So I tend to be in favor of those kinds of endorsements at the community level, and I certainly don't believe that by eliminating endorsements that it would have any material impact on how people perceive news organizations.
Well, again, Marty, thank you very much.
I just have one last question for you. What do you think of government support of the industry? Some kind of government support to help preserve us?
Right. I don't believe in it. I think it would be a huge mistake for journalists to rely on on support from the government, because what the government can provide, the government can take away. I mean, just imagine if we had an industry that was largely dependent on government support over the last 4 years. What exactly would have happened if President Trump felt that former President Trump felt that certain news organizations were not, were not doing what he wanted? He would put pressure to withdraw funds.
Sure.
And then it would be a matter of life and death for those news organizations. And what would their response be? We can't depend on the government. We're supposed to be independent of the government. And so I'm adamantly opposed to that idea.
Well, again, thanks very much for spending some time with us, Marty. We appreciate it. All the best with your book. Good luck.
Thank you.
I wish you all success. And we're going to be, looking closely to see what happens not only with the media, and Cindy and I have talked a lot about it, but also, what sort of actions you're able to take and what involvement you're going to have as far as the future goes. Because I think those of us who've been in the business a long time certainly have an investment in it to make sure it survives.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Well, thank you for having me, and good luck to you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Okay. All right. Take care.
Bye-bye. You've done extensive research into our business, the business of newspaper in particular, and media in general, mainstream media I call legitimate press. What did you get out of our conversation with Marty Baron, who had a very, very interesting career in journalism, and of course retired as the executive editor of the Washington Post. So, and he's seen a lot of changes occur. Mm-hmm. Are you any more encouraged, or what did you get out of this thing?
Well, I've always been more encouraged than you about the future of the business. I was most encouraged by what he said about continuing to encourage young people to get into the business. And it was interesting that he mentioned that they had people, new reporters coming into the newsroom who said the same thing as I had heard in our newsroom, where older workers were telling the younger workers to get out. And I think he was very thoughtful in what he was saying about the future of the business, that it's, that we have to look to a more modernized industry in order to survive, and that we are in basically a huge transition between old storytelling, new storytelling, using all the modern technology. Even though he's retired and he's been in the business for 45 years, I found him to be very forward-looking and very encouraging.
Yeah, and he did talk about the changes that have occurred, and that newspapers, the print editions, are not going to. Nobody's going to start a print edition newspaper in this day and age.
Yeah.
And therefore, the internet and other platforms are going to be the future of news. And I did sort of, I wanted to raise a question with him because, as we both know, the Vindicator was a comprehensive news deliverer. I mean, we did local news, we did society, we did sports, we did obituaries, we also did national news and international news. There are now, there's a study that's being done, one of the conclusions of a study is that local newspapers should no longer cover national and international news, should only focus on local issues. And I think that's a mistake.
Well, that's an old conversation. I mean, that's been going on for years, and I think it's a mistake too, because as a local newspaper reader, I was always more interested in the national, international news. So if my local paper isn't going to carry it, I'm going to go elsewhere to find it. And the newspapers are going to go online, and I think one of the things that we're going to have to battle is, and he mentioned it as, people are gathering in tribes online. So you're reading news that already agrees with what you believe.
Right.
And I mentioned in my farewell column at the paper, the column by Jim Bishop, where he said that what he loved about newspapers was the surprise after turning each page. So he was referring to the stories that he would never have read if he hadn't seen the headline. And I think that's one of our challenges online, is to get people to turn those pages somehow, whether it's an actual page, if they're reading a bona fide digital edition where they are actually turning pages, or if we just have to keep referring them to other stories that will pique their interest. I think that's one of the big problems we're going to have.
And Marty did talk about, there are now other platforms delivering news, and in fact, in conjunction with this segment, I'm hoping that we can have two more. One is with a couple of veteran journalists who left newspapers and have created what's called post-industrial media in Pittsburgh, and they have newsletters, they've got online, they do podcasts, they do all kinds of things. And the interesting thing about them, and I'm hoping to arrange for them to join us next week, the interesting thing about them is they're selling advertising. Mm. And they've taken that sort of direction. By contrast, we've got Mahoning Matters, which was created by McClatchy.
Yeah.
And it's a new experiment in news, in local news. The person locally who heads it used to be at the Vindicator, Mark Sweetwood, and I'm hoping to at least to get in touch with Mark to see if he'd be interested to come and talk about what they have done, and sort of the changes that have occurred and how he views his role today as a journalist compared to the traditional newspaper journalist. So,
well, I have to say, I've probably in the last year or more been listening to podcasts, various podcasts, and there's just hundreds of interesting podcasts out there. I never thought that they would take hold, because they are usually an hour to an hour and a half long. They all have advertisers. I've been listening to one called Mea Culpa by Trump's former attorney, Michael Cohen, and he's got all kinds of advertising on there. I don't recall hearing any on Katie Couric's podcast. There's a few others that I listen to. Most of them have advertising, so I've been a little bit surprised that they are so popular, that they are attracting that kind of advertising revenue. But, you know, that may be just part of the package.
But what I think what sort of worries me is, I'm speaking from experience with the Vindicator, even though, as I pointed out to Marty, that we'd be accused of once of being Republican or Democrat newspaper, we made it a point to provide all views, you know, conservative, liberal, middle of the road, especially on the editorial page and especially on the commentary page. But
I definitely heard from my conservative friends that we're a Democrat liberal newspaper.
And that sort of, you know, that's something we couldn't overcome. But be that as it may, yet people would be able to pick up the paper and read a George Will column, and sort of then read a Ruth Marcus column
or a Sowell column.
Exactly. What happens with these podcasts is I don't think you're getting that kind of balance. And so
that's why I said it's probably going to have to be part of a package, because you definitely aren't getting that, but they usually have guests, you know, so like Katie Couric and Michael Cohen have guests that they interview, you know, just as we interviewed him.
Right.
So you are getting a variety of views. There are some that are just a particular topic that I listen to that don't have. Well, even those actually have people that they interview, but it's just on one particular area usually. But I think that, you know, that may be, and that's kind of what Marty hinted at, that we've got all of these new technologies, and you know, it's probably not going to be one entity anymore. You're going to have, you know, the online print edition and a podcast and the animation and the videography that our photographers became so adept at. And I think maybe you're just going to have to take the whole package to get the whole view that we used to produce in one, you know, paper product.
I'm glad we were able to get Marty on. You know, he's in great demand, obviously, because of his background and experience, and I appreciate the fact that he joined us.
It'll be interesting to show where he pops up. I'm sure he's going to be at some school teaching something. I hope.
There's no doubt about it. I mean, it's with his, you know, with his experience, and so we are hoping that, you know, people who tune in to watch this will come away with an understanding of what's going on in our business. Perhaps understand why a 150-year-old newspaper called the Youngstown Vindicator actually closed its doors and left a void, I believe, in the community. You know, perhaps people will start thinking about the future and actually the meaning of news and, you know, how it's delivered.
And paying for it.
And paying for it. Thank you. Thanks for joining. And I'll work with to see whether we can get a 2 more segments to this podcast.
Okay.
The best prophet of the future is the past. As important as it is to collect and preserve artifacts, how stories are told will shape their understanding for generations to come. Mahoning Valley Historical Society shares our local history through exhibits, programs, online platforms, and live events throughout the year. Being a valued resource to local news media further extends our educational support. Visit us online at mahoninghistory.org to see why teaching Mahoning Valley history is our pledge to you.